Hi, this is Corey Kineska, and you're listening to The Knights of Ren.
Have you now?
You're fulfilling your destiny.
Show me again the power of the darkness.
D20 Radio, where gamers roll. D20radio.com. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, to the Knights of Ren, episode 204. This week we have Rick and Jay. Welcome to the show, gentlemen.
Hey. Hey.
We have a special guest joining us, though. Corey Kineska, who is the head designer of Destiny, is our special guest, and welcome so much. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's great to be here.
So we're just going to jump right in and, query you the best we can. But obviously, the first question we want to know is, what's your connection to Star Wars? Like, what was your first movie? Why do you like it? Just tell us your history with Star Wars.
Sure. I mean, as long as I remember, Star Wars has been a part of my life. I mean, just growing up as a kid, like in the early 80s, like at least two of the films were already out. And I remember seeing Return of the Jedi like at a drive-in at when I was very young. I just remember vague pictures of it, but it was, how do I say, it was just everywhere. I had books and toys, and as I grew up, of course, the prequels ended up coming out much later when I was much older, but like in between that time, like I was, like many Star Wars fans at that time, just looking for anything there was. I was reading the novels. I played a lot of the old Decipher, CCG back in the day, and just if it had Star Wars on it, I probably owned it or had played it or read it or something.
Okay, cool. So then, now that you're the head designer of Destiny, so can you
co-designer with Lucas?
Oh, co-designer. Okay, so
Yeah.
is it any different from what Lucas does?
Yeah. So I mean, my position at Fantasy Flight Games is I'm the vice president of research and design. So my job is I get to design my own games, but I also oversee all the game designs that are going on. So depending upon what game is being designed at FFG, I'm going to at least play it and have a little bit of feedback, and in some situations I'm going to be more involved and perhaps get hands-on like I did with Star Wars Destiny.
Okay, so in this case, you're more hands-on. What does that translate to? Like, are you playing more of it? Are you designing more of it? Or is it kind of a culmination of both of those things, as opposed to, say, something you just like you're looking at and then you have input on?
Absolutely, yeah. With Destiny in particular, so all of our games start out with a vision meeting, which is basically after we've decided that we want to do a product, we sit down with the designer, and at the time it would be myself, my boss, Christian Peterson, and the designer, which was Lucas at the time. We sit down in a room, and at that time, we already have a sense of what type of product we want to make. We say we want to make a collectible card game where players are famous Star Wars characters and are fighting each other, and it includes cards and it also includes these dice. And from there, we just kind of have a big brainstorming session, and we talk about all the sorts of different directions that could go in, and maybe if we have any specific things that the licensor needs or that we really want to see in there, and we make sure that that's all kind of agreed upon, and then the designer will write that down and submit like a formal vision document. And that's when we all kind of agree upon this is what the game's going to be. And then the designer goes and they start designing the game, and that's when they try to adhere to everything that we've agreed upon, but until they actually have a game and have played it, we don't really know how or if it's going to work. And so in a lot of situations, my involvement after that point is basically playing the game occasionally, giving some feedback, redirecting things a little bit, or consulting with them as they run into problems. With Destiny, I was more hands-on in the sense that Lucas made a bunch of different designs, and then we came together and we started collaborating a lot more. And so him and I remember, must have been maybe a couple of weeks to a month where both of us were sitting down. Our desks were right next to each other, so like every couple of hours we'd turn to each other and be like, what if we did this? What if we did that? And we were independently working on different parts of the game and then coming together every day and seeing what things are most interesting. And then we used all of those ideas to kind of develop a prototype and then play a bunch together. And we'd be like, well, this thing that sounded really cool on paper didn't work at all, and change directions. And so a lot of the ideas and the fundamentals of the game were really changing a lot at that point. Like, for example, I remember early on, I had this crazy idea. I said, what if there's no such thing as a game round in this game? What if instead it's just, I do one thing, you do one thing, I do one thing, you do one thing. And at that point, there was no end of round. There was no like passing, and there was no claiming the battlefield. And so you could spend an action to refill your hand. You could spend an action to ready your characters. And it turned out that was completely broken. So I remember Lucas came in, he was like, well, that's pretty cool, but it's completely broken. We can't get it to work. What if we have a reset at the end of the round that you have certain steps that come in? And so that really brought the game together. And I know a lot of the early development was us figuring out how to make it feel like it was a card game and a dice game, and not just a card game that uses dice or a dice game that uses cards. And so like finding ways to make the two systems speak to each other and tie up together, and also make it feel like you had ways to mitigate luck, because I know there have been a lot of card games in the past that have tried to put dice in a CCG and it just hasn't worked. Or, I mean, it's worked, but none of those games have been super successful. And so we were trying to walk a very fine line. And Lucas was, he was the guy that came up with the idea that, well, what if you could pitch any card from your hand to reroll dice? And that was one of the other kind of big eureka moments where we said, you know what, that mitigates the luck, and it also makes the cards and dice speak to each other. And when we started doing that, that's when the game really started to sing.
Man, that's really cool. Do you have any more stories or insights into the early design of the game? Because that's something no one's really talked about, and it's extremely interesting that you were at a point where, you know, the fact that you could take an action and ready your characters or refill your hand that's really neat.
Yeah, you should try playing that way sometime. Just see what happens. See where we were a year and a half ago. Yeah, there was a lot of stuff, I mean, that was on the drawing board that made it, or a lot of it that ended up getting cut. One of our big challenges, honestly, right up to almost the end of development, was to figure out how to make battlefields work. Because for a while we were playing without battlefields, and the game was fun and it was interesting, but there were a couple of reasons we wanted battlefields. First, like thematically, we felt like it really felt like Star Wars if you had some more context, like, well, where are we? Where are we fighting? And so we had a lot of different prototypes where we had like battlefields that were different locations, and really none of them, it always felt tacked on. It never felt like an integral part to the game. And it wasn't until Lucas came up with the idea that that we use the battlefield as kind of this first player token that passes back and forth between the players, that we said, okay, well, let's run with that a little bit. Let's figure out if this is a token, if this is a card that also kind of gets passed back and forth, how can we make it feel like it's an important part of the game? And so that's where kind of the claiming the battlefield action came from. There was a long period of time where we had there wasn't actually an action for claiming the battlefield. It was just when you passed, you got the battlefield. But then it ran into some problems where you couldn't, if your opponent did something and you were kind of waiting for the right moment to play your dodge or your block or something, you couldn't actually wait for that moment, because as soon as you passed, you claimed the battlefield and it knocked you out of the round. And so that's when we said, well, what if, I think this was definitely Lucas who said, well, what if passing is something that you can do? You can pass and then you can come back into the round. What if claiming is a separate thing? And so it took us a long time to figure out, to make both of those things work and be valid, and then the naming of what they were. Because one of them, it was originally called passing and stalling. And a lot of playtesters were getting confused because passing was when you claimed the battlefield, stalling was just what passing is now. And near the end, when we were writing the rulebook, I suggested, what if we call it claiming the battlefield and passing, because those two things don't sound like synonyms like stalling and passing do. And that's what we ended up going with, and it seemed to work, so that's good.
When people ask me, like, what is it I like about Destiny, I mean, I can't imagine the game without the battlefield mechanic. It's my favorite part, being able to control initiative, which is something that was a large part of Conquest design, and
Sure.
it really shines, and it's what, to me, it's what makes Destiny Destiny. Like, a lot of other mechanics are great, but the battlefield, just like how tense it is to try to decide, like, should I cut my round short to make sure I like can explode, or like trying to guess how many more actions they're gonna take, and then guess if they're guessing you and what's in their hand. Oh, it's too good. It's amazing.
Good. Yeah, I mean, it took a lot of experimentation to get there, and I think that at one point Lucas just made a prototype that is the way that it is today, and we played it and we said, yep, this is it. This is right. Let's keep it.
All right, so the next question I have, when we talked to Lucas earlier in the year, we talked about top-down design or bottom-up design, and you were saying, the two of you came at it from two different perspectives and two parts of the game, and then you worked together and bringing the game together. So can you elaborate on the part you worked on, and then what's your design process? Are you top to bottom or bottom to top?
I usually start with the theme first and let the theme inform the mechanics, but occasionally I'll come up with a mechanic. I mean, I probably have like a closet full of mechanics somewhere that are like little ideas that I want to put in a game at some point, and so they poke at their head every once in a while and end up in a game. But for the most part, it's thematically, let's figure out what feels right, what makes sense for this particular game. So a lot of what I was doing on the project was, early on, Lucas and I we were collaborating on what the core mechanics for the game would be. He was very focused on the specific abilities, and at the same time that he was kind of working on abilities, I was working on figuring out, like, well, a lot of logistical type things, like how many characters should we have in this game, how should we divide them up, how many cards are we going to have in the first set, how could we collate them, what are the rarities. And so although those were kind of our focuses, we were both sharing the design aspect of it, and so we'd be focusing on everything, come back, play, and then kind of show each other what we were working on, give each other feedback, go off into our corners, do our thing, and then come back. As you might imagine, since I'm also overseeing a lot of the other projects that are going on at FFG, I didn't have as much time to dedicate it once things started rolling. So once we had kind of a core design that was working, that's kind of where I stepped back from it, and Lucas really kind of did just about everything at that point, from like assigning artwork and running all the play testing and like continuing to develop the card pool and that sort of stuff. For example, I didn't have that much input into the second set. We talked briefly about some of the mechanics and some of the things that we wanted to put in there, some of the characters and that sort of stuff. So we agreed upon those sorts of things, but almost all the cards were designed by Lucas in the set, and so I was more hands-off once the core game design was up and rolling.
So you're talking more like on the how many characters for each color in each faction, so like 4 of red and blue and villain, hero, that sort of thing, and that's something that's probably going to stick pretty close to the same throughout the sets until y'all, I guess, decide that y'all want to do something different, right?
Yeah, probably. I mean, as long as it keeps working for us, we'll stick pretty close to it. I mean, a lot of the discussions we had early on was Star Wars is such a huge universe, and there are so many characters that people want to see. And so one of the big things we had to decide was, how do we divide the characters? And so like landing on the 4 colors that exist in the game was something that happened pretty early on, figuring out how to take all the beloved characters in Star Wars and figuring out which of these buckets do they land in. And then we had a lot of discussions about, well, what's the unique play style for each of these buckets? What makes dark side force users different than light side force users, and also there's the different eras, and so how many characters do we do from each of the eras? Like Awakenings features characters from The Force Awakens, like on the packaging and whatnot, but we knew that we didn't want it to be just about Episode 7. In fact, Episode 7 wasn't even out at the time that we had started designing this game, and so it started with us just saying, we know these characters are in it from the trailers, but we have no idea what they do. And so we didn't actually land on exactly what their abilities were until after the movie had come out. But we also wanted to make sure that we had prequel characters in there as well, because that's also an important part of Star Wars, and it's honestly something that we haven't had a chance to explore too much at FFG, because most of our games are about the classic era. And so making sure that we were touching all the eras and all the factions, and seeing which main characters we wanted to include, discussing which main characters we wanted to save for perhaps future sets, because you don't want to put out all the beloved characters right away. You got to save some fun stuff.
So you brought up you worked on Episode 7 content before you knew much about it. We can assume that for Spirit of the Rebellion, you had to create, Road One stuff. Did Disney provide you any even just cliff notes, or how does it work working on a property that's an upcoming movie like that?
It could be challenging. Because there are certain things that are written in stone, especially when it comes to this type of character, this is the sorts of things they do. But as you've heard probably from reading things online, a lot of Rogue One changed, it sounds like, from the filming to what was released at the end. There were probably some things that we inferred from some trailers, that those scenes were later cut from the films, which isn't to say that those things didn't happen, but they're creatively building a movie at the same time that we're building stuff about it, and so there's only really so much that we can do. But things like character archetypes and what somebody's about and what their personality is and the sorts of things they do, those are things that were pretty set in stone, and either we could tell from the trailers or we could ask our contacts at LFL some questions and they could answer us on.
Awesome. Yeah, watching the Road One trailer now is honestly really frustrating, because 70% of that isn't even in the movie. There's no TIE fighter at the top of the radio tower that meets Jin. That scene. That looked so cool. It wasn't in the movie. It drives me crazy. But yeah, that's interesting.
If you read the article about there's a scene in the trailer when Jin is walking down this corridor and the lights light up around her. It's like this cylindrical corridor with the Death Star lights.
Yeah,
kind of iconic. It's even on some posters and stuff. And there was an interview with the director where he was talking about how they just took that shot. They didn't know if they were going to use it, but she was just walking through that set, and they said, "Wait, that would be an awesome shot. Let's take it." And so they filmed it, and then it ended up something that someone found on the one of the reels, and they put it in a trailer, even though he didn't think it would actually show up anywhere.
That's actually a question I was literally about to ask. Do you ever have that happen in your design process where, you have an idea or a mechanic or a theme and you throw it out there and you don't maybe necessarily think it's going to happen, but somehow it does, just because of, the cards falling into place?
Yeah, I'm sure that sort of stuff happens. It's strange. Game design, sometimes things that you'll talk to somebody about and get really excited about. Me and Lucas will be talking about a mechanic, what if there was a die symbol that did this? Oh yeah, that'll be awesome. Let's do it. And we get really excited about it. We mock it up. We sit down, we play it. And the first time we play it, it's just immediately obvious that it was awful and didn't work at all. And then there'll be an idea like the disrupt icon that ended up on the dice that I was I don't know, man, stealing resources, that just sounds like it's going to break the game. And we played with it, and the more we played with it, the more we're you know what, that actually works. Let's keep it.
Can you elaborate on some die faces that were cut from the game?
I remember Disrupt used to do something else, because Lucas had came up pretty late in the process, the idea that it sucked away resources and it really just worked. But there was a different mechanic that disrupted. I think disrupt was it was kind of like focus, but against your opponent's dice. So you could turn an opponent's die to the side of your choice.
Oh, wow.
And it turned out that most people weren't using it because their opponent could just discard a card from their hand to re-roll it. And so we decided that it just wasn't really working.
It's kind of funny that you talk about these things that didn't quite make it in the way that they were, or that, you know, you had a whole dedicated action or something for it. And then you think of it, you look at it, and a lot of the cards that are printed on here have some of that in there, kind of like that disrupt being, you know, messing with your opponents, turning the opponent's dice to a different face, but then you have like use the force and immobilize and things like that still use that same type of mechanic, but not in the way that you were saying. Is that how some of that stuff came to be?
Yeah, I mean, having those cards that let you manipulate your opponent's dice are pretty crucial to kind of the design. It goes back to the idea that the dice and the cards are talking to each other. And for a while, we were calling those cards counter cards because you'd use them to kind of counter your opponent's moves. And we wanted to make sure that each faction had a certain number of counters that were thematic to that faction, but were also balanced against what the other factions were. And so there was a lot of talk during the process figuring out what's kind of the golden standard of removal cards. And for a while, the yellow rogue card that lets you remove an opponent's die with value 2 or less.
Electroshock.
Electroshock. Yeah. Electroshock for the longest time was remove any die. For one. And so, yeah, right. and so that was kind of the golden standard that everything was measured against. Well, if you're spending 1 resource to remove any die, what does a 2 resource one look like? What does a 0 resource one look like? But we found that it was almost impossible to make any other counter cards that costed 1, because removing 1 die is pretty awesome and amazing. And so that's when Electroshock got the nerf, where it's like, well, you have to be able to spot a yellow character, and it has to be value 2 or less. And so that...
it didn't have
some of
spot
the kind of
either.
tweaking.
Wow.
Yeah. So
it's still, I mean, sounds like you nerfed it twice, and it's still like top 5 removal card, bar none.
Yeah,
it still hits like
it's amazing.
97% of dice in the game somehow.
Yep. Yeah, it's still really good.
So when you're designing these cards, when you were playtesting with Lucas and you're trying out all these ideas, what do you determine, you know, this card, this effect, this mechanic, this is broken, this is OP, you know, because you've seen a lot more things than we have, and you've been able, you know, even talking about Electroshock, like 1 resource for removing anything, that's amazing, but in this infrastructure, that's a little bit too good. So I mean, you know, how do you quantify that when you're looking at, oh, these cards, these are terrible, we got to nerf them, they're too good?
Well, I think personally a lot of it comes down to finding something to compare it against, because as soon as you're looking at like, okay, well, here's a 1-cost card, let's see another 1-cost card that can remove dice, is that fair? Here's a character that costs 13 points, what's another 13-point character cost like? And playing a lot of games with them, and my favorite way of doing it is just trying to exploit it, right? Just trying to build that broken deck that takes that character's ability and just like completely builds a deck around it and tries to, well, be as efficient as possible. One of my favorite decks during playtesting was Jango Fett and General Grievous, and at that point Jango Fett's ability was Balatik's ability. And so Jango Fett would ready when an opponent's character was defeated. And Jango Fett's die is a lot better than Balatik's die is. And so if you brought a 2-die Jango Fett and you ended up like defeating an opponent's character, Grievous was able to steal one of their upgrades, and Jango would ready himself. And it was pretty gross. And Lucas was like, I know you really like this ability, but we can't put it on Django. It's way too good. And so I'm like, okay. And so we had the game for the longest time, and then he brought it back for Balatik, so I was happy that it came back.
I think it's safe to say that Django has a pretty decent ability still, though.
Yeah. He's still pretty sick, though.
I love Balatik, so I'm not unhappy with this die. Obviously, it's not Django, but yeah, Bal is pretty great.
Things that may fall through the cracks from that initial testing that you were mentioning, What is your preferred way to deal with them? I mean, in some games, they just, well, this thing is just too good. It's winning all the tournaments. We got to ban it. The Star Wars LCG came up with a restricted list where they would restrict different pairs, things like that. What's your preferred way of handling that sort of thing?
It's really challenging. I mean, I know from talking to Lucas that he doesn't like banning cards and doesn't like errating cards, mostly because I think we both agree that it can be frustrating for a player to show up at a tournament with a deck that they're really excited to play and suddenly be told, oh wait, that card's not allowed anymore. So you've got an illegal deck, or that card does something completely different than what it says on it. And so it's definitely something where if it needs to be pretty obviously and objectively broken for us to want to do any of those things, to have to ban a card or make a restricted list or errata a card, just because of those sorts of experiences that can happen to players. And also, I know there are some players that can get really frustrated that, like, what you see is not what you get when you look at your card. Like, I have to just kind of hold in my head the idea that this does something different. And so, I mean, if something does prove itself in any of our games to be just, like, dominating, like, we will step up and we'll make changes about it. Like, for example, in Imperial Assault, I did a lot of work designing the skirmish game for that, and it became pretty obvious after the first tournaments for Imperial Assault came out that there was a certain list that everybody was running and that was always winning, and that was Royal Guards and Imperial Officers. And they both had costing issues. They were both too cheap and too good for what you get, so they were just the most efficient things and the fastest things that you could have. And so we did end up having to errata those characters, and I think that the community really appreciated that we did. So it's unfortunate when we need to do it, but if something like that happens, we want the game to be healthy too.
So it's pretty safe to say that banning and errating is maybe like a last-ditch effort type thing, that you'd be more along the lines of maybe printing something and following sets that, I wouldn't say like silver bullets, but things that would be there to kind of, if this is an issue in your meta, you can play this card to help alleviate that.
We've done some of that in the past. It can help the issue, but you're right in saying that banning and errata stuff is kind of a last resort. We'll do it if we need to, but hopefully we don't need to.
Yeah, we, as in us on the Knights of Ren, we've been play testing this game in some fashion since the first spoilers have come out, and we've kind of seen it go in waves of certain cards, saying people just kind of screaming that, oh my god, this is crazy, how did they let this come through? And then we wait a month and nobody talks about it again. Like the first thing being like Sith Holocron, everybody was just, oh my god, how did this make it past development? You can't do anything about this, you have to play this card. And then a couple weeks later, people realize that it's not overpowered. You balanced it out in the die faces. It's hard to hit that special all the time, and there are cards like Electroshock that you can use for it, disarm, things like that. And then nobody talks about it for a while, and then you get the Django thing. How do you beat Django? And then people start talking about it, and then a while later they don't talk about it anymore, and now it's a Hyperloop. And we probably feel that in a while that's going to be one of those things where people realize how to play against it, and it's not as bad as initially thought. Does that kind of mesh with the way that you feel on the design of that the Awakening set as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Lucas and I were just talking about the same thing a couple of weeks ago, just kind of the trends that we see following the forums online, that it seems like every couple of weeks somebody comes up with a deck that's really powerful in the meta, and everybody scrambles to find a way to adapt and to deal with that deck. And then a couple of weeks later, no one's talking about that one anymore, and a different thing comes up. And so I think Lucas did a great job creating the set, because there's still things that people are discovering, and different types of decks that we haven't even thought of that are going to show up and be super powerful pretty soon. And it's really exciting, and it's really cool to follow. And it's a little bit reaffirming to see that once people kind of get it out of their system, and once they kind of figure out how to play against these decks, that they stop the fire and brimstone discussions and they move on. It's obvious that people are passionate about the game, and they want to feel like it's a fair and that it's not like there isn't some OP thing that they have to play. And so I think we view it as a very positive thing that there's so much discussion about it and there's so many strategies that people can come up with.
Yeah, I think it's good for people to know that y'all are following this discussion, kind of in the background.
Yeah.
And you're watching these things as they unfold. So, it doesn't go on deaf ears, but it doesn't need to be screamed at from the top of a mountain either for if one person feels that this is broken or something like that. You guys are actively watching how things unfold.
Yep. I mean, we make it a point to not post on forums because as soon as people expect us to be there and we're not there, it becomes a problem. But we definitely read the forums and we definitely see people's concerns and see what people are playing and hear what people are talking about.
It's interesting to you specifically in regards to, like, right now Destiny is only in the first set, and, a lot of us have played a lot of games, and first sets are usually designed, I don't want to say like they have like intentional holes or like weaknesses, but I mean usually there's like things that like can't all be covered, and so there generally are cards in base sets that shine, and then as more sets come out and the playing field gets a little more level for everyone, kind of like dissipates. And it's it's not to say again like base sets don't have problem cards or that all the answers are in the future. Like you can't intentionally design like that and expect everybody to wait either. But it's just an impression that I did with Destiny that like you guys really front loaded a lot of good, as you referred to them, like the counter removal cards that can let you like get some breathing room or score you an extra turn or two. And in a lot of these cases, these decks that people have like been nervous about, I mean, in my experience, like I make it for my friend to play against me, and then it just makes me play better to try and, all right, how do I maneuver around this? And I haven't, sure, I've had games where my friends dropped the Holocron on Tuscan and got Mind Probe turn one. Like, yeah, it happens. But there's also plenty of games where, I've removed their dice so much that their Vader never got to like swing for any amount of damage whatsoever, and I've had games where I've like been completely unscathed. Like it goes both directions, and I think like a lot of the game has answers for you, and I feel like people try to play lists that don't carry as many answers to try to do a bunch of fun neat things, and I just think the answers are there currently, in my experience and in the events that I've run and been in.
Good.
Yesterday I took down 30-man event with my Django Trooper Elite Balatik deck, and like honestly the two star cards that I just added this week were On the Hunt and Cannon Fodder. And Cannon Fodder
Really?
twice. Yeah, Cannon Fodder of all cards kept Balatik from getting one shot twice in two separate games against Django Veers. So
I think a lot of people underestimate Cannon Fodder. It's really good.
being able to equip an upgrade, spend all your money, and still have a relevant removal card it's amazing. It's allowed me to jetpacks and hold out blasters more confidently without like running out there and like crap. Now I can't play flank, which was generally like the issue I was running into before. Yeah, Cannon Fodder. That card is awesome.
Yeah, my favorite deck that I kept trying to make during early design or early alpha was the deck that had no upgrades in it, and I just wanted to have events and support cards and find a way to make that work. And so there was a point during testing where I was doing pretty well with that deck, probably too well. And so we ended up removing a lot of event cards and stuff that had direct damage on them, so that damage mostly comes from your dice, so that your opponent isn't like just playing cards that are deal 2 damage, deal 3 damage, because it is a game about dice and cards, and I guess I pushed it too far.
I was going to ask you, you were talking about Cannon Fodder is underestimated. What other cards do you think people are kind of glossing over that might become a lot more popular or more played as the game grows and evolves?
That's a good question. I personally really like it when a future expansion will come out and make you go back and look at a card that you thought was maybe garbage, and suddenly you're like, whoa, this card's actually great now because I can combo it with this character. I'm trying to think of any specific cards like that. Yeah, I can't think of any of them immediately off the top of my head.
I know personally I'm looking forward to more targets to Commando Raid, because I really like that card, but you can only play it with Akbar. He's
Sure.
the only guy with a red discard side for heroes, and can only presume that more are coming, so that's one
I'm
that I
sure
really
there will
like.
be.
And as that card gets better, I'm sure Surgical Strike will get more time to shine, especially if these Millennium Falcons keep causing people stress.
Yep. Yeah, ways to destroy the support cards. I think there's certain things that we're going to want to make sure are in every set, and it'll be like ways to control supports, ways to remove dice, those sorts of things.
When you're in this design process, so set 2 is we're pretty sure we can imagine it's done, but set 3 you're still working on. If you were to see something in this meta right now, what is the shortest amount of time you could do in creating a card to help kind of slow that problem down, quote unquote problem?
That's an interesting question. Like this game's a little different than our other games in the sense that it has dice and it has random collation, and so those things kind of add time onto production. That kind of the rule of thumb that I usually tell people, from like how long from when we send something to the printer until when it actually hits store shelves. For like a normal board game or an LCG or something, it's about 6 months, give or take. And so that's a ballpark average about how far ahead we need to design stuff. That's how long it takes to produce. So we would need to design and test something before that point.
I have a question from one of our members, our listeners, and it's Andrew Heinz, and he wrote a nice long paragraph, but in a nutshell, the question is, we've seen Palpatine, we've seen characters at different point numbers. Do you guys, how do you design a character and just say, this character is X points? Do you have an algorithm? Do you have a certain specification that, this character is, has to be more or less? Like, how do you approach numbering, costing a character?
That's a great question. Early on, we had a spreadsheet that I threw together that took all the stats of a character and kind of like the sides of their dice and spit out a ballpark of what their starting cost should be. And so we're like, if you plug in their health and you plug in all the faces of their die, it would like come up with, here's the starting point of what this character is, assuming they had no ability. And then once you put an ability on them, like, it's completely out the window. Maybe it's an ability that makes them even worse, or it's an ability that makes them much, much better. And so that is what we use really early on to kind of like set a benchmark for what different point cost characters need to be. But as after we got past the first set, we've been able to move away from that a little bit more, mostly because we've learned a lot. And a lot of this comes down to, for example, a character like Rey. Her die has a lot of modifiers on them, a lot of modified sides. And so a single die Rey is inherently worse than a double die Rey because she's less likely to be able to use her modified sides. But that's not something that an algorithm can necessarily catch. And so we've just... a lot of this stuff is probably in Lucas's head at the moment, but there are a lot of kind of little lessons like that we've learned where, like, okay, well, this character's got modified sides, it's less likely that these will work. They should cost a point or two less. This character's die doesn't have any costs on it. None of their die sides cost resources, and so like they're just a little bit better. And so you have to look at a character holistically. And like if you look at Spirit of Rebellion, for example, you look at Jyn, and a lot of people have commented on how expensive she is, but her, like, figuring out what to cost her ability was challenging. I know I wasn't personally the one that ended up balancing her because Lucas did most of set 2. Her ability is also something that works regardless of how many dice you bring with her. And so her ability, it's going to work once during every round. It's going to reduce the cost of the first yellow event you play by 1. But if you bring a second die with her, it's not making that ability any better. And so you have to factor that into the costing of a character. Does their ability get better when they get a second die? If so, do they require an extra point? And so we do all that to get in the right ballpark, and then it just comes down to play testing. Like, seeing different point lists, seeing people building their teams. Like, I'm never going to choose this character that costs 15 points because there's already a 15-point character just better in every way. And so playtesting is when we start knocking things down a point or up a point or significantly sometimes to make it work.
So also in that design process of points, are you also micromanaging the numbers and die faces on a character? Say for Jin, for example, it's two ranged, discard this and that and the other. Have you ever looked at her points and said, okay, let's change these variables to something else to justify the point cost?
Yeah, that's absolutely happened. At least in the initial set, it definitely did. I can't speak to the future sets.
So, the thing that like players ask a lot is, or like assume is, the comment that makes us laugh is, why isn't Palpatine 30? Like, why stop at 28? And the thing that I keep trying to tell people is like, because he's a 28-point character, like there's no point to round him if he's not a 30. Like that, to me, that just gives you design space to make a 30 that's even more ridiculous than Palpatine was. One of the funniest comments that I think about now that Lucas said was like, you like the base set characters, you haven't seen anything yet. And like, Palpatine's an awesome example of that. And I have to ask, like, which one of you came up with Krennic? Because he's the 10 out of 10 for me, because he interacts with the battlefield and I love it.
That was definitely Lucas. Yep. He did that. He did Palpatine as well. He was a big champion for, I really want there to be a character that you can run by itself, and if we're ever going to do it, it's going to be Palpatine. I'm like, all right, you can make it work. Yeah, no, Krennic's great. I was very impressed with him as well. Like, it's cool that he interacts with another die in a way that we haven't seen before. And command, the red color's always been meant to place extra importance on the battlefield. That's just kind of one of their tropes. And so the fact that his ability ties into that, it feels really good.
Was it difficult to design Palpatine? I know you said, Lucas championed that, but obviously that can't be an easy thing to have a mono character that, there's a lot of speculation on how to stop him, but he's still very viable. Like, can you enlighten us on that kind of process where, you're running multiple characters and multiple decks, but here's this one guy who's so good, you can play him and he can still win games?
Yeah, I mean, it's challenging. I've designed things like that in other games before, and the danger is it's a very all or nothing approach. Like, for example, in X-Wing, when we were designing the really expensive ships like the Millennium Falcon, the difference between, like, you've got a bunch of really small things that die, which means that you're losing power as they die, or you've got one really big thing that's slowly taking damage, but it's still at full strength until it dies. It's very different. It's a very different flow to the game. And I know for Palpatine in particular that Lucas went through a lot of different abilities to try to make him work. And I remember reading a bunch of different abilities that he was coming up with that just weren't working, that he would throw them away and try something else until he finally landed on something that the testers were liking and he was liking.
Okay, we have a couple of fun questions for you. Travis Wellams asks, what was your favorite card to design?
Probably General Grievous. Just like, he was designed for a very thematic perspective where, like, we see Grievous collecting Jedi's lightsabers, and I wanted Grievous to be able to do that. And so that's what he does, but he can take people's blasters and other stuff too.
I mean, no reason not to.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, he's really interesting because he's got the 5-point jump from 1 die to 2. And I mean, and he deserves it. Like, it's frustrating for us because there's so many like cool 13s that you wish you could team him up with, like Kylo. But hopefully future sets he gets some more friends and he gets to shine more, because I know people play like Dooku and stuff with him, which is neat and it works, but I'm hoping he like maybe gets a weapon and spirit or something that like really makes him come out, because I would like to see more Grievuses running around. He's an extremely fun card to play.
I had a lot of decks with Grievous in them, but I've stopped running him just because people always target him first and want to kill him first, and so I get sad, so I run somebody else.
So since you designed Grievous, a lot of people have asked this, and I personally also want to know, was there any point at which he could carry 4 pieces of equipment? He broke that rule of 3 per character?
I don't think so. The restrictions on the number of upgrades that a character can have is something that also evolved during testing. There was a point where characters had levels that dictated how many upgrades they could have, and so he was a level 3 character or a level 4 character, which meant he could have 4 upgrades, and it turned out to be unnecessary. But I don't think we ever made a thematic conceit for him to be able to carry a 4th one. It wasn't tested, to my knowledge.
Okay. Another fun question. We've got a lot of people playing multiple levels of knowledge, brand new, experienced, tournament world players. Is there any advice you'd like to give to people, of all ages, of all experiences that can help, when they're playing a game, maybe to see something different or understand a game mechanic a little stronger and for their advantage?
One mistake that I see a lot of new players make is not having enough cards that can interact with their opponent, not enough removal cards, not enough cards that can kind of turn that moment around. They get so focused on what they want their deck to do that they don't think enough about what their opponent's deck's going to be doing. And that's just something that players who haven't played this sort of game before don't even think about. But I always try to make a high percentage of my deck have a lot of removal and counterplay.
All right, so a question a lot of our listeners have asked, and we're just going to ask you and see what the answer is. There has been some, product shortage in the United States and around the world. Do you have anything you can say about that for our listeners?
Ultimately, this game has proven to be more popular than any of us, wildly more popular than we anticipated, which is fantastic. I know it could be very frustrating for people who want to get their friends into the game and that want to get more product themselves. And I just ask you to be patient. We're doing the best we can, and we want to be able to have more product out there. And it just takes a long time to produce this sort of stuff and to be able to react. And so give us time, and we'll get through this together.
I mean, we really appreciate the fact that you're able to talk about it. We know it's a little difficult for some people, but I mean, we know you're working really hard, and we just wanted to let them know that it's not, you're not trying to short the product. You're trying to get it into people's hands, and you want more people to play the game.
Yeah. We want people playing it, and we don't want there to be... There's a danger in either direction. Overproducing has other problems, and so it's very challenging, and we're going to do the best that we can.
So back to game design, something I've always wanted to know, you guys you said you determined that there were 4 colors in the color pie. How did you determine we're going to do gray, yellow, red, blue? Why those 4 colors instead of, something else?
Oh, as far as those specific colors, why is rogue yellow?
Yeah. Why did you determine, I feel like a force user should be a blue card instead of a green or a purple or some other color?
That's a good question. We started just with colors that would be easily identifiable from each other, and so we started with basically the primary colors, and we played around with using green, and we played around with using purple and orange and these secondary colors. Ultimately, we spent a lot more time, honestly, thinking about what hue of yellow and what hue of red and blue to use than actually what specific colors, because early on, we figured out that those colors were the easiest ones for people to tell apart from each other, and then it just came down to what type of character do we give each of them to. And that was a completely subjective call, and I honestly don't remember how we decided that yellow was going to be rogue versus... I think it matched up pretty closely with what we had done with the LCG as well. I remember that the yellow characters were the Scum and Villainy faction, or no, not the Scum and Villainy, it was the Smuggler faction in the LCG. So I think we had already gotten used to the idea of that being kind of the characters that weren't as affiliated to specific factions.
I think it's kind of funny that I never even realized that those were the primary colors. It just hit me when you said it. That's why that you didn't use purple, because you're using red and blue, and it just makes more sense for what people see across the table and stuff like that.
You've gone through multiple dice, like the sides. When was there a point where you obviously had a pool of things you could put on a die? At what point did you start to make cuts and say, this, we're not using that, we're not using this? You said that, disrupt and discard were different things. You kind of squished them into what they are today. Was it a larger pool? Is it a smaller pool, in the design process of what the dice actually did?
It was always about how many symbols we had right now. we decided early on like what a good number was for just symbols that people had to memorize, and we pretty much stuck with that. I think the biggest thing that evolved throughout the course of design was how we were representing them on the die. Like, we knew that we wanted to have these full color dice, but determining exactly how much space we had on the dice, to make sure that not only could you tell what character it went to, but you could also tell what the symbol was, what the number was, like how big is that area, and how much stuff can we fit in there? Like, do we want to go into double digits on numbers? Can we fit this little plus in there for modifier? We spent a lot of time kind of working with our graphic designer to find a way to represent this information and how much information we can put on there. But the number of icons was pretty steady, even though what they did changed significantly.
Okay, we have a few questions, and then we're going to wrap up the show. But what's your favorite deck to play right now?
I've been playing a Han Solo deck that it's actually Han Solo, a Padawan, and a hired gun, which is kind of a strange mix of characters. I run a lot of removal and manipulation in my deck. It's definitely not a deck that would probably do super well in tournaments, but Lucas was running a Vader Night Sister deck using holocrons, and he was going undefeated against people, and I managed to beat that deck. And so his undefeated deck went down against my really strange, unexpected deck. But I know Lucas played at the tournament we had at FFG a couple of weeks ago, and he was running a mill deck, and he made it. I think the only game he lost was against the guy who ended up winning the tournament. So a lot of people around the office. I mean, we played a ton. Just a lot of casual fans, and a lot of hardcore fans as well. We're just during lunchtime, you'll see the lunch area in FFG, and there's always people playing Destiny, and they're always running different, strange, unexpected decks, and it's a lot of fun to just walk by and see what people are running.
You were talking about, you were able to look at a character and determine which side they went on and which color they went on. Can you elaborate on that process a little bit more?
Sure. I mean, we made a list. It's like, okay, what's every important character in Star Wars that people are going to want to play? Including, like, no-named characters like Stormtroopers and Tusken Raiders and whatnot. And we took that list, and then we said, okay, if we're going to split this up into factions for each of the sides, how do you do it? And there was a lot of discussion about, well, what do these colors represent? Do they represent their capabilities, like in the sense of a Force user? Does it represent like their organization, like command, or does it represent the fact that they have none, like Scum? They're all kind of defined a little bit differently, and there was a time when they meant all the same thing. Like, we said, okay, let's say Force user is a color, and then we'll have like leaders are a color, and that's what red will be. They'll be like all the leaders of the factions, leadership, and then we'll choose some other trait that people have, and that'll be yellow. It'll be like, I don't know, trickery, and so all the yellow ones are characters that have lots of trickery. But one of the problems we ran into, which wasn't completely solved with this, but a lot of characters in Star Wars are all of these things. You got a Han Solo who's a leader, and he's also kind of a roguish character that tricks people. And so it's like, well, where do you put him? And so we decided that, well, let's choose this Han Solo that we're doing right now. What is his most important trait? What's the most important thing about him? Well, obviously the fact that he's a rogue, that he's not a Force user. You can't stick him over there. And this particular Han Solo is not part of the Rebel Alliance yet, or not in so much as the other Rebellion characters are, and so he's not going to be in the command faction. And so it came from trying to make equal-sized buckets, or roughly equal-sized buckets, that were all interesting and could be fun to play, and then the characters just kind of naturally fell into the places once we had the right definitions of what the buckets were.
One last question. Sean Vale asked something, and I also wanted to know, are we ever going to see a card that can be played both on a hero and a villain faction? Is that potentially something you might be working on in the future?
Well, I mean, we already have upgrades and stuff that you can run in both. Are you talking about a character specifically?
Yes, like you could see, say, like for example, we've even talked internally here about, hired gun could be hired for good or bad or, heroes or villains. Is there potential for any character in the future to be playable on either side, since they're not necessarily, their allegiance is not to any particular faction?
I mean, it certainly could happen. We had a lot of internal discussion about that topic, and there was a time when we played around with Tusken Raiders being played with either side or hired guns being played with either side, and ultimately we decided that it was just going to be too confusing to new players, and so we decided not to do that. But I could certainly see it happening. I wouldn't rule it out. I can't say for sure if it will, though.
Great. Well, as we wrap up the show, do you have any questions for us?
What are you guys most excited about for Spirit of Rebellion?
Ooh, I'm excited to see what you have in villains, because Palpatine is fun, Krennic is really fun, and the fact that we haven't seen anything in yellow is very intriguing to me. I'm very much a villain player, and if blue and red already have characters that are exceptionally just incredible, like, I'm just chomping at the bit for what yellow does.
Yeah, you guys spoiled Palpatine and Krennic, and I'm sitting here like, who's the yellow legendary? Come on. I mean, obviously you can't tell us everything up front, but I definitely love me some bounty hunters, and obviously I still can't say enough good things about Krennic, and I want to see more cards that interact with the battlefield for sure. And just yeah, I don't know. We're just really excited. We're hoping to hear more soon.
Yeah, and when Lucas was on here a while back, he said that, they were a little hesitant on what they could put on the die faces for the first set, like the numbers wise. And he said that in the next couple sets, we may see things creep up a little bit, and we are seeing that a little bit from what we've seen so far. And it's pretty interesting. It's not going overboard at all, but you do definitely get a sense that the die faces are a little more wide open with what we've seen so far.
It was a big challenge for Lucas to be designing the system at the same time that he's putting die faces on dice, because it's very hard to kind of separate the two of them and determine, like, is a die balanced or not if the environment is still changing. And so now that the environment has settled, like, he's got a much better handle on it, and he's able to do a lot crazier and more interesting things.
Well, once again, thank you so much, Corey, for joining us on the show. This has been, I've learned a lot. It's been fun, and we really appreciate you guys coming on the show and talking about, your design processes and, this, that, and the other. It's so enlightening, and just thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. It was fun.
All right, so thank you everyone for listening to this week's show, and may the Force be with you.